Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Central Bank of Brazil and the International Cooperation Agency from Germany, GIZ, I would like to greet all participants and our public. We're going to begin the third day of our webinar, Regulatory Initiatives Based on the Sustainability Dimension of AgendaBC hashtag. On our program today, we have panel 3, Risk Transmission Channels within the Financial Sector. I would like to say that Mr. Luis Pereira's keynote presentation from the BIS will be retransmitted today at the end of panel 3. The moderator will introduce the speakers of the panel, will moderate the panel, and will lead the Q&A session. You have the floor, Mr. Sean Kidney, co-founder and CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI.
Much for the chance to be with you today. We, as you know, have a major challenge around the environment, around climate change, fundamentally about ensuring the sustainable development of our financial system and the sustainability of our financial system. It's exciting to be part of this program with the Banco Central do Brasil, which has been going for 2 days. We're at the tail end of this particular program to look at these kinds of issues. Today, we have with us 2 eminent speakers. We've got my old friend Remco Fischer from United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. He's in charge of their climate change work programs. He's been doing this for many years, since I first started meeting him at UNFCCC conferences when he was a much younger man. His most recent big win, I would say, is the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which has got 33 investors part of it, which represents 5 trillion, which is extraordinary. But there's been many more things that he and the UNEP Financial Institute have worked on, whether it be the principles for responsible banking or principles for sustainable insurance and so on and so on. He'll talk a little bit more about that. After him, we'll be joined by Jean-Philippe Svoronos, who is the Senior Financial Sector Specialist at the Financial Stability Institute of the Bank of International Settlements. He's had 20 years of experience in the Bank of International Settlements. As you know, the center of our global banking system in so many ways, including data, where I go to all the time to find bond data in the work I do. They've been looking at a range of things, including where to go with the Basel Committee, which is one of the things that Jean-Philippe will mention in these conversations. Just in case you're wondering, he has had a bit of an experience in the private sector at Société Générale, so he's acutely aware of the grey areas, the need to make sure that what works from a regulator's perspective also works from a private banking perspective. I'll let him speak in a little while. Can I now welcome Remco Fischer? I'm going to call him the guru of climate change at the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. We're incredibly pleased to have you with us today. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean. I hope you can hear me fine and everyone can hear me. Good morning to our Brazilian audience. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much to the Central Bank of Brazil and partners GIZ and others for giving us the opportunity to speak here. The organization that I represent is UNEP Finance Initiative. We are a United Nations run network of 350 financial institutions, from banks, investors, insurance companies, the overwhelming majority of those from the private sector, so commercial entities. There's a few state-owned entities also in our membership, including from Brazil. And our membership is 50% developed countries and 50% developing countries. Our mandate is, you can assume this, to green the finance sector so that it can use the tools that it has to help green the real economy. And the tools that the finance sector has, of course, are engaging portfolio companies, engaging policymakers, having an influence on the cost of capital of projects and companies so that they help steer those that are sustainable. Within Unipaf, I cover the climate program. I wouldn't call myself a guru. I'll let you do that, Sean. But I am responsible for the climate change activities. So to me, greening the economy means two more specific things. One, decarbonizing the economy so that we mitigate climate change at the pace that's required. And we also need to make the economy more resilient to the physical impacts of climate change. So climate change mitigation and adaptation. But as you will see from my talk today, there are two prongs to this work. One prong is what I just said, mobilizing finance so that it helps enable climate change mitigation and economic adaptation to the physical impacts of climate change. The second prong is supporting financial institutions to assess, manage, and disclose the risks, the financial risks of climate change, so that, of course, they remain resilient and profitable in light of the climate change phenomenon. I want to tell you today about the Unipaf work on financial climate risk, what we've done over the years, very importantly, how that work has been significantly sharpened and boosted by the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I'll be focusing quite a bit on that framework, and why I think it is spot on as to what climate-related risks are, how they manifest, how they transmit, and how, by extension, they need to be assessed and disclosed by financial institutions. Once I've told you about this big picture, the big Unipaf journey that over the years we have done on climate risk, I will go into a slide deck and we'll delve into some of the more technical, methodological aspects of the work that we've been doing as we've been supporting financial institutions to manage these risks, to assess these risks, to disclose these risks, and to mitigate them. Before we look at our work, though, on financial systems, a few words on where we stand at the moment with this climate change phenomenon, which, of course, Sean, as you said, provides the backdrop to our discussion today. So at the moment, we have a density of CO2 in the atmosphere that is 417 parts per million. A few years ago, only 7 years ago, the more iconic, perhaps, threshold of 400 ppm, parts per million, were crossed, and that tells you we're still not making progress on stabilizing that concentration in the atmosphere. Sorry, I'm having a little problem here with my computer. Try something. Excuse me for a second. I'll be right back. My one screen just got blacked out, so which is where I have my notes, but I have a second screen and that's still up and running. So I'll be able to continue just in a second. So I said this concentration of CO2, we're not making progress on it. It's higher by 30% now than it's been when measurements began in the 1950s, and it's double the amount it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, just 200 years ago. And it's highest now than it's been in at least 800,000 years to 3 million years. And the consequence of that, we already see that, as we look out of the window, is our planet is today 1 degree warmer than the pre-industrial one. And that 1 degree already is, of course, changing the face of the planet, the health of ecosystems, and the lives of people in many disturbing ways. And there's a long list of things I could take you through that tell you how that manifests and how that shows. I'll keep it brief. We don't have too much time today, but here are a couple of manifestations of that. The 5-year period, 2015 to 2020, was confirmed as the hottest on record, reflecting exceptional warming both on land and in the ocean. The global mean sea level rise has risen 20 centimeters, at least since 1880. 11 of the 33 strongest category 5 hurricanes on record have occurred in the last 14 years, and the list goes on. There's been exceptional forest fires in many places of the world, California, Australia. In Australia, the figure is that 1 billion animals got killed because of these unprecedented, unparalleled forest fires just this year. And I understand also in Brazil, there are forest fires, and other climatic events that are unparalleled and unprecedented. All of this is the result of a 1-degree world, which begs the question, do we want to end up with 4 times this, which is our current business as usual greenhouse gas emissions trajectory that would take us to a warming of 4 degrees by the end of this century? And for perspective, the difference today in this global mean temperature between today again and what we had during the last ice age is about 6 degrees centigrade, just the other way around, of course. So let me now go back to the work that we've been doing with financial institutions and how that work has focused on risk. We've done this work, we've conducted this dialogue with our membership, with our 350 members over the years, by and large using a terminology of risk and opportunity, because that's of course the terminology that the system uses and that the system operates in. And the hope was that if FIs and the objective would truly realize and capture and act on these risks and opportunities that climate change throws at them, that would help green them, that would help decarbonize the finance sector so that it decarbonizes the real economy. The second thing that we've been focused on has been reporting, disclosure, transparency by financial institutions of their climate-related risk exposures and their climate-related strategies. And here again, the objective was, and the whole disclosure will create awareness. It will create impetus, it will create competitiveness, even if disclosures remain voluntary. That they would create a kind of a race to the top as to which FIs are financial institutions are achieving to manage these risks in the savviest, most sophisticated and professional ways. All of that explains why there was music to our ears when in 2017, under the mandate of Mark Carney, at the time governor of the Bank of England, and of course, chairman of the Financial Stability Board, published the TCFD, the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And we thought that's exactly what's needed. And there are 4 characteristics of that framework that really make it quite the innovation that it is, and that really steer the climate risk assessment and disclosure agenda, in our perspective, in the right direction. The first characteristic is it's forward-looking. In other words, the assessments and disclosures that the TCFD demands from the finance sector have to be forward-looking. They need to be scenario-based. Up until 2017, disclosures were static at best and retrospective at worst. And the problem with that is, of course, that the climate isn't. The climate is changing, it's not static. And that's why disclosures from organizations say on today's carbon price or on today's extreme weather probability would not be particularly insightful, because we know that these risk drivers and risk parameters are dynamic and they're going to change into the future in ways that we cannot extrapolate from the past. The second characteristic of this framework that made it quite innovative is that it views financial institutions not only as the readers and consumers of disclosures by portfolio companies, but that it also sees financial institutions as preparers and issuers of disclosures themselves. That makes sense because climate risk becomes a threat to financial stability, of course, when it accumulates to dangerous levels, and that happens mainly in the portfolios and books of financial institutions. Disclosures are therefore really needed at that level. The third characteristic was an institutional link to the Financial Stability Board, which of course gave it quite a bit of political weight and helped elevate the climate challenge to where it belongs, where it needs to be, and the climate risks challenge, which is on the boardroom tables in the consciousness of the leadership of financial institutions. And the fourth characteristic was that it covers the various, in a very comprehensive way, the various climate risks and climate risk types that are at play here. Number one, transition risks. namely the risks that stem from society's efforts to decarbonize economic activity. Second, the physical risks. So in other words, the risks from the impacts that physical climate change as a phenomenon is having and will have on economic activity. And then thirdly, the climate-related litigation and liability risks. We're big fans of this framework at Unipaf. You can see it's not difficult to like it or to endorse it, but it's very difficult to adopt and implement it if you're a financial institution, especially if you're a financial institution. Carrying out these risk and opportunity assessments at the level of portfolios across asset classes that are exposed to different sectors and geographies in a forward-looking and scenario-based way for both carbon-related, which are the transition risks, as well as the physical climate impact risks, is far from trivial. So the work that we did and the work that I'm going to take you through a little, and I'm going to show you the methodologies, etc., over the last 3 years on this topic as Unipaf was about working with our members through coalitions of volunteers, of the willing perhaps, to pilot these methodologies, the data and the tools required in the financial sector for the evaluation of these risks. We've been now working with 80 financial institutions. I saw a chat just now, a comment in the chat. I'll be going through the slides in a moment, so just bear with me for a second. And all of this work that we've been doing with the sector has focused on developing the methodologies, both for transition and physical risks. In terms of asset classes, we've covered with banks, in particular corporate credit lines, with investors, public market security portfolios, and with insurance companies, property and casualty lines. A few learnings from these 3 years of work before we go into the methodologies. It will show you how this works and how these climate risk assessments can be executed in such a forward-looking manner, as I said. The first learning is climate change risk truly now is landing in the consciousness of finance sector executives. And there's truly an appetite by FIs, we see this worldwide, to be on top of climate-related risks. Doing this in a forward-looking manner remains complex. It's not trivial, but it's starting to become doable. The methodologies are being put in place. The scenarios are being adapted to the needs of financial institutions. And obviously, you know, we are proud to be driving that process. The scenarios need to become, though, more usable for financial institutions, and that's something that we're working on through a number of fronts. But most importantly, one learning is that we need to very openly recognize that this framework, or as a climate risk framework, is of course not meant to ultimately green the financial system or decarbonize the financial system. Its ultimate mandate is to ensure financial stability, not climate stability. In other words, to give an example, if you are an FI and you believe the future is a 4 degrees future, and you've done all of these assessments and you've looked at the scenarios and you've come to that conclusion, then you will assume a 4-degree future also in your risk management. And not only that, also in your strategy and in your portfolio steering going forward. For us at Unipaf, as an environmental organization with an environmental mandate, that means that an exclusive focus on risk management is not going to be enough to do this greening of the finance sector that I mentioned at the beginning. And what we need to do on top of that is to add an element of sheer societal leadership to that work. We need the finance sector to step forward, say what we want is a sustainable future, a 1.5 degrees compatible future, and we want it so much that we're willing to make commitments and set targets that will transition our own businesses into such low carbon states. And this is a lot of the work that we've been doing at Unipaf too. If we could perhaps go to and open the slides, please, Eva.
And Just checking, we've got Jean-Philippe on call. Jean-Philippe, you might need to go or mute. Someone's putting you on mute, but we're all okay to go now on that side. Just double checking while you get back on it, Remco.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sean. And can we move please to the next slide? I already mentioned this. One of the key characteristics of the TCFD framework is that it covers all the relevant types of climate-related risk and how they can lead to financial impacts. And in a nutshell, those are the physical risks and the transition risks. And as I said, the transition risks are those stemming from society's efforts to decarbonize the economy, while the physical risks are those stemming from the physical manifestation of climate change. Within the physical risk category, we need to distinguish between two other types of risks. One are the slow and incremental and creeping risks, perhaps, such as desertification, such as the glacier, the melting of glaciers, and sea level rise and other such risks. We also have within that category, though, the increase in the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather. We can go to the next slide, please. And this gives you an overview of the universe of financial institutions that we know, because they've been working with us, have been really driving these methodologies. And as I said earlier, it's about 80 financial institutions crossing a number of different financial industries. Next slide, please. We can go to the next slide too. And we've been speaking quite a bit about the scenarios and what role scenarios play in these forward-looking disclosures as are prescribed or demanded for by the TCFD. And these are typically here, what you see here, the scenarios that we've been using for our work. So there are, and it's a spectrum of scenarios, and there are on one side of the spectrum scenarios that assume a very rapid decarbonization of the economy, very rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Those are scenarios that would be considered to be compatible with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, which is the UN Agreement on Climate Change, which is to limit global warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century, ideally striving for 1.5 degrees. In such scenarios here, it would be, of course, the transition risks that I mentioned before that would be more pronounced, and the physical risks being perhaps less pronounced. But in their entirety, it is these scenarios that would be considered to be the most sustainable and the ones with the least damaging effects on the economy overall. On the other side of the spectrum, one would have the business as usual scenarios, meaning business as usual trends and trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions that would take us to 4 degrees of warming, and a truly catastrophic set of physical impacts, and hence there the physical risks of climate change would be more pronounced, and the transition risks would be less pronounced. Next slide, please. And here you see this a reflection of the work that we have done in the form of report covers across transition and physical risks across the financial of the various financial industries. And all of these documents, what they do, they can be found on the Unipaf website. Of course, you know, today we won't have the time to go into all of the detail, but what they do is they give guidance to the industry on how they can go about using the scenarios, linking them up with their portfolios and loan books so that they can start making assessments of how climate change will affect risk metrics going forward. Next slide, please. And in terms of the fundamental approaches through which financial institutions can carry out these risk assessments, here again, there is a spectrum. And on the one side, on the one end of the spectrum, there are the so-called, well, approaches based on the assessments at the macroeconomic level. And this would, here the approach is quite similar to the stress testing approaches that banks would, for instance, already carry out. It's looking at changes in macroeconomic variables and then making assessments as to how those changes will impact financial portfolios. Here one could say that this approach will tend to be a little bit too coarse for the risks at hand. So a lot of the climate-related risks are not going to be appropriately captured because they will manifest not at that level, but rather at the sector or subsectoral level. On the other side of the spectrum, we see the borrower level approaches. This is where institutions can go line by line in their portfolios, trying to borrower by borrower do an assessment. And while of course this would be the most accurate approach, it would also be quite cumbersome for most financial institutions to do this, because it would be quite a lot of work. And then we have in the middle the approach that's more at the sector level. This is more feasible because banks would not have to go down to the borrower by borrower level, and they would be able to capture some of the exposures, but not all of them. So we can move to the next slide, please. And I'm just trying to find pull my notes together again. This slide here shows you against that spectrum of approaches that I just took you through, what is the approach that our work in the end landed on. And I would say it's a little bit of a sweet spot that tries to balance out the effort and an amount of work that is required by banks to carry out these assessments with, on the other side, the insight and usefulness of those assessments. The methodology operates largely at the sector level, but then in addition, it helps banks segment their sectors into relevant subsectors. So say, from the level of a power generation, it would help them segment that down to the level of renewables-based power generation or fossil fuel-based power generation. And within those subsectors, then it allows for the creation of samples within which banks can carry out also more of a borrower by borrower level assessment. So it's a little bit of a hybrid approach that tries to combine the best aspects of the spectrum of approaches that I presented earlier. Next slide, please. Sean, by the way, how are you doing on time?
You need to finish up. So we're going to be over from now on.
Okay, let me just take people through two slides on the methodological approaches. I think those are going to be quite useful to understand the drivers that people are keen to understand. I'll do that for transition and physical, and then we'll wrap up.
It is important stuff, so go ahead.
Here is the methodology for credit-related risks in corporate loan books for transition risks that we developed with 20 banks, and that now is being applied roughly and piloted by 50 banks. First, of course, what you see here on the upper left-hand side are the climate scenarios that I've been speaking to, or a specific example of a climate scenarios. These are models, as I said, that link various plausible temperature outcomes by 2100, so either 2 degrees, 1 degrees, with the corresponding greenhouse gas emissions pathways and the corresponding technological changes that need to occur for that temperature outcome to be achieved. In the first step, the methodology helps yield for a given scenario in a given sector what we call risk factor pathways. There are 4 risk factor pathways that you can see here, which are changes over time in some of the key economic variables for the sector at hand. And these 4 risk factor pathways are as follows. One is direct emissions costs, as you can see here. So for instance, the effect of carbon prices on the emissions in and from that sector at hand. The second one is similar, but not the same. It's the indirect emissions costs, meaning the effects of things like carbon pricing on the upward or downward supply chain of that sector at hand. The third one is revenues. How are the revenues of that sector going to change for the scenario at hand going forward? And the fourth one is low carbon capital expenditure. In other words, how much capex is needed in that sector at hand for that sector to achieve the required reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The methodology then, as I said, enables banks to segment sectors into more granular subsectors and to establish for those subsectors, and based on the risk factor pathways, segment sensitivities, which you can see here on the lower left-hand side of the slide. This is why the methodology pans out principally at the sector level. At the same time, and for each segment, the methodology facilitates the creation of samples, as I said, within which client-by-client type analysis can be done, and a client-by-client type analysis of how our risk ratings going to change based on what the scenario is telling us will be these risk factor pathways, the 4 that I've mentioned. And then based on that sample analysis and on the sector sensitivities, portfolio-wide assessments can be made. Next slide, please. These here are some illustrative visuals that tell the story of what this methodology can do. You can see here on the upper hand side a display of a 2-degree scenario for power and electricity generation. Through the methodology, the scenario gets expressed, as I said, in these risk factor pathways in economic terms, such as in revenue, change in indirect emissions costs, and changes in low carbon capex. And then on the lower left side, you see the output of the methodology, which is the evolution of probabilities of default for different segments within the power generation at hand over time. And here we've chosen 4 different such subsector segments for power generation. It's illustrative. One is regulated utilities, one is unregulated utilities, and then across both high carbon generation technologies and low carbon generation technologies. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how the methodology also enables a point-in-time comparison in the future between different levels of probability of default, depending on the scenario at hand. What happens under a 4-degree scenario versus a 1.5-degree scenario or a 2-degree scenario. Next slide, please. All of these methodologies are documented in the outputs that I presented earlier, but there's also an online tool that we have developed with partners that enables banks to use that tool, input their portfolio information, choose the scenarios that they would like to simulate, and that yields the types of outputs that I've just presented. Next slide, please. This will be my final slide, and it provides a deep dive on the other side of the risk equation, which are the physical climate change risks. And there's a methodology there for that too. What is worth mentioning here, as you can see, is that the methodology will pan out and will a little bit differently, will vary a little bit depending on two factors. The first factor is, are we looking at only the incremental changes from climate change, such as sea level rise, desertification, increasingly higher temperatures, glacier melt, etc.? Or, as I said earlier, are we looking at the changes in frequency and intensity of extreme weather? Depending on which one it is, the methodology will have to vary a little. The other factor by which the methodology will vary is whether we're looking at the impacts that physical climate change is expected to have on the productivity of a sector, and by extension on the productivity of the clients that a bank has in that sector, or whether we're looking at the impacts that physical climate change is expected to have through damages of physical assets and through impacts on the value of those physical assets. And perhaps just because we're short on time, people can find detailed elaborations of these methodologies on our website. Perhaps we can go to the final slide in my slide deck. Well, I could say a few words about this here too. The methodologies that I've presented on so far were for banks, and obviously in their corporate credit loan books, and their data can become a real issue because you're dealing with companies that do not have climate-related reports. They don't provide data on those attributes, and that's why the methodologies that you've seen so far rely a lot on sampling, reducing the amount of clients that a bank would have to analyze and then extrapolating that. This is a reflection here of the work we did with institutional investors in public markets. There, the picture is very different. There, you're dealing with big multinational, at times, companies that do provide that information through sustainability reports. That information gets gathered in databases, and those databases can be used for an execution of risk assessments on a line-by-line, kind of company-by-company, security basis. But now, perhaps if we can go to my last slide, that would be good.
That's slide 17 for the operators. Keep going.
And this is just really so you've gotten a glimpse of 3 years worth of work, and involving 80 financial institutions worldwide across 3 financial industries. That work is not coming to an end now, is continuing with a wide host of technical partners that you can see here. And if you are a bank or an institutional investor, then you are more than welcome to join us in this journey. And if you're interested, of course, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you very much. I look forward to the Q&As.
Thank you, Remco. Jean-Philippe, you're up. I can really commend these groupings and associations. So in terms of suggesting to, for example, Brazilian banks, if they're not already, they should join these. Definitely worth doing. And the content and material that's coming out of these coalitions is just superb. So thank you, Remco, for the work you've done in making this happen. Jean-Philippe, from the Bureau of International Settlements Financial Stability Institute. You are up, sir. Someone needs to fix the audio. I'm afraid we've got no audio, Jean-Philippe. We are having our problems here. Ah.
Hello.
Fantastique. Comment s'il vous plaît?
Yeah, so sorry. Oh, now it's a problem with the sharing the screen. Excuse me, gentlemen. It doesn't seem to be my day.
So as you can see, our listeners, while Jean-Philippe is figuring it out, we are experts in climate risk on this call. We're still learning to be experts on Zoom and application of PowerPoints, but we're getting there. We're all on this learning curve, this COVID era learning curve.
And we're not very good at operational risk either.
Sure. Back to you, Jean-Philippe. Have you got something working yet? Voila.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. So sorry. Next slide, please. There we go. And the next one, please. So what I'd like to talk to you about briefly is the focus of the current work of the Task Force on Climate Risk created by the Basel Committee at the beginning of this year. It will be focusing on climate-related risks as opposed to ESG. The main reason, to cut a long story short, is simply you need a starting point. The problem is huge, complicated, and complex. Therefore, you need to, well, you simply can't do everything at the same time. And you need to start by, let's say, a piece where there is at least some consensus regarding as to the way it's going to be analyzed, because that's the starting point. So that's climate-related risk. Next slide, please. Oh, one buzzword which you will hear quite a little bit is about, oh, you'll hear me using it several times, is the term sequential approach. Essentially, nice fancy term, means dealing with problems one by one and trying to solve them, as opposed to trying to do everything at the same time. No more, no less than that. Now, that's what we used to call our, how would I say, scaremongering slide. Why scaremongering? Because in reality, especially if you compare with some of the slides and some of what you've just heard from Renko, you will see straight away that the scenarios that have been picked here, the 2% temperature increase scenario and the 3-degree temperature increase scenario, are rather mild ones. Remember what Remco was saying just before? On the current trend, if we do nothing more than what we do currently in terms of transition risk, we are on a path of global warming of +4 degrees. So not +2, not +3, +4. Now, when you look at the numbers like that, and including some of the numbers mentioned here, just on the physical impact, sea level rise, by the way, it's 0.4 to 0.8 meter by 2100. In other words, 40 to 80 centimeters increase by 2100. You could say, okay, well, 2 degrees more, 3 degrees more, 80 centimeters more, in 80 years' time, what's the big deal? And that's one of the issues or one of the problems that are quite often not highlighted enough, is that these are global averages, and behind those global averages, there's a huge amount of dispersion. In fact, plus 80 centimeters by 2100 is the global average, but at one extreme, at the poles, North Pole, South Pole in particular, this will mean in terms of temperature, we're not talking plus 2, plus 3, we're talking plus 6, plus 8 degrees. We're not talking higher sea levels of 80 centimeters. In some places, we will be talking about higher sea levels of 6 to 8 meters, which of course changes completely the story. Next slide, please. So point here is, you sometimes hear about global averages. You also need to look at the dispersion around the average, and in particular at the extremes, because this essentially means that some places on the planet will be not only harder hit by others, but might even become slightly unlivable if the current trends continue. And that's why you need to worry. And that's why you need to do something about it. And the second reason why you need to do something about it, whatever you believe about the wobbly assumptions that might be introduced in some of those projections, because they are all assumption driven, essentially, and they can't be otherwise, especially if you're doing a projection 80 years out, is precisely this level of uncertainty. What does it mean essentially? In some cases, it means that you can have variations around your average, or vary of 1 to 15, and variations between the extremes of 1 to 30. So in other words, the bottom line here is, we don't know how bad it's going to get. We know that it's not going to improve if we do nothing, however. So going to the risks, we've already covered those to some extent. What I'd like to emphasize here, and what this slide misleadingly does not indicate, of course, as you know, there are physical risks, plural, but there are also transitional risks, plural, and liability risks, plural, not singular. Why am I insisting on that? In particular for transition risks, to show you that this is anything but simple. It's both complex and complicated. Each country is in a different situation, not only because it's not exposed to the same types of climate, so therefore not exposed to the same types of physical risks, but also because each economy is different and each economy has a different energy mix. So in some cases, decarbonizing means reducing reliance on coal. In others, it means reducing reliance on coal and oil. In others, it means reducing reliance on oil. And you can have all sorts of interactions and all sorts of cases of it in between. Moreover, if you start driving down or drilling down into the issue, you will even see that there might be various transition risk paths within a given country. Now that's true for big countries. It might even be true for smaller ones. Why is that? Well, because different regions will have different types of economic activities, once again, and different energy mixes. So, you know, pick your choice. The transition risk policy in California, in practice, will not have the same kind of impact as it could have in pick your choice, Ohio or Pennsylvania, to take the example of the United States. You could make the same kind of comparison in or for whatever country you can pick. Other point here, especially if you're talking about transition risk, but it's also true for physical risks. When you start looking at the transmission channels and the risk drivers, there are two types of features that are extremely difficult to model. One is the interactions between some of the features. And then the other one is about cumulative effects. Interactions, what do I mean by that? Well, here again, take the example of transition risks. Pick whatever country you can think of. The government of that country comes up with a number of policy changes, decides to transition and fix a target date of zero net carbon by 2040, 2050, whatever, and say introduces a carbon pricing scheme, which will obviously have a number of effects on the economy and create a number of incentives. What kind of incentives, for instance, does that create, especially if it's reinforced by subsidies, on technical innovation? Well, that's where it starts getting interesting, because there can be all sorts of technical innovations that are encouraged by the effect of the policy. One, of course, and that's the one that first comes to mind, are all sorts of technological innovations that are going to make renewable energy more competitive, cheaper, more widely used, more widespread. But they are also technological innovations, such as, in particular, all the technologies around carbon capture and storage, which are currently not entirely competitive and can be quite dangerous, which could lead to some interesting effects which are currently not necessarily included in the various projections. What is carbon capture and storage? Essentially, it's a bunch of technologies whereby the carbon that is emitted by the corporate, the entity, whatever, is captured instead of being released into the atmosphere and then stored, typically buried into the ground. Now, those technologies are not yet competitive. They're not yet, how would I say, usable with the same kind of, I'd say, ease as, for instance, electric car batteries. But you can clearly see the evolution here. And also another little point about those technologies, by the way, they're simply not safe, because the big problem is the storage. You need to store not only in large quantities for a long period of time, but you also need to make sure that your storage is safe. In other words, no leakages, and no leakages over time. And then there's a third element also in transition risk, which can accelerate, amplify the transition. And those are all effects related to changes in customer and or market sentiment vis-a-vis a certain firm, whether on capital markets or whether in terms of pricing and demand. Next slide, please. Now, here there are just a few examples of some of the effects that transition risks, even if, or transition risk policy and or physical risks can have. Note that obviously those are simplifications those little graphics, because you can also have, as I was alluding to just for the slide before, you can have cumulative effects. You can have several physical risks taking place at the same time, reinforcing each other and or amplifying. You remember we had, or we talked about in the presentation before about wildfires. Guess what happens when you have extreme heat waves? Those tend to be followed or can be followed by wildfires, especially, say, under what is called a Mediterranean climate. And they also can be followed during the autumn or fall by rains that become or are now increasingly becoming even more concentrated and even more torrential than they used to be 20 or 30 years ago. Torrential rains, flash floods. So you get, within the same year, intensive heat, possible wildfires, intensive rains, flash floods. And of course, you need to be able, or you need to, especially if your exposures as a bank happen to be concentrated in one of those regions, you need to be able not only to factor in and model the effects of the 3 or 4 various climate risks, but you need to be able to model the cumulative effects. And then you also need to be able to capture the second round effects. And that for the moment is, let's say, extremely difficult. Next slide, please. Now, climate risks and higher uncertainty. As you've kind of realized, I've been insisting quite a lot on the higher uncertainty. Climate risk is underway. I think that's beyond question nowadays. The impacts are still muted with a big quote unquote. The impacts are clearly visible throughout the planet. What is meant by muted, and that's an extra little wrinkle or difficulty sometimes, is that they are not yet material for financial institutions, meaning banks. They are, and can be very much so, material for insurance firms. But up to now, there hasn't been a single bank that has run into problems solely because of climate risk. That doesn't mean that it's not a big risk or a big set of risks. It just means that the risks are somewhere behind your horizon or just about on the horizon and coming at you. However, you don't know how quickly they're coming at you, and you don't know how hard they're coming at you. And that's part of the problem. I'll skip the little piece on averages, which I just mentioned before. I'll just focus on the fact that acceleration, intensification of climate risks is often assumed, but sometimes it's difficult to establish, or at least difficult to establish for all risks. And by the way, contrary to what you might think, this is not a way to try to minimize the impact of climate change. On the contrary, it means there is even more uncertainty, and that should make people even more worried. Why? Because if there's one thing, if you look at all the work that has been done on climate over the past 2 or 3 decades, pick any given topic in terms of climate risks, rising sea levels, wildfires, whatever, you will see that every new report that comes up, or almost every new report, when you compare the contents to the previous one and the one before and the one before that, somehow it reveals that the previous estimates were underestimating, for one reason or another, what really happened. So this means here, at the very least, that, and that's one of the big problems, of course, in terms of data and statistical risk modeling, there is a breakdown in patterns, the so-called non-linearity or clustering of events. This means that even in cases where you used to have masses and masses of data, or at least a lot of data for a long period, typically hurricanes, typhoons, things like that, the frequency and the severities of future events are much more difficult to predict, and that's the nice way of putting it, than they were before, because the past patterns are breaking down. Typical example taken from recent news, I don't know if you've heard, but traditionally hurricanes, typhoons, you used to be able to consider that once you've had one, you were kind of safe for the next X months, if not for the next X year, if not for the next year, sorry. Quite recently, Manila has been hit 3 times in 3 weeks. Complete breakdown in pattern, meaning complete, or rather extremely and increasingly difficult to be able to predict. Also, the other point I mentioned, much higher level of uncertainty surrounding estimates. What you need to understand here is that this is not necessarily true, or this is not necessarily new. You already have that kind of problem. There is a level of uncertainty when a bank tells you its probability of default is X basis points or Y basis points. There is a level of uncertainty because it's an estimate, not a precise number. When a bank tells you my LGD is 40%, the level of uncertainty, or the margin of uncertainty, is, however, relatively limited, and even in some cases at least, it can even be estimated itself and calculated. So when the bank tells you my average LVD on my portfolio is 40%, what it is in fact telling you is that all the exposures in that portfolio have something, LGDs of something between 25 to 45%, so that on average, on a portfolio basis, I get 40. The problem with climate risk estimates, as I started to show you, is that the dispersion around the average is huge, so that you get a level of uncertainty that you don't have when trying to assess the traditional financial risks. Next slide, please. Now, integrated risk management. What does that mean for a financial institution? Sorry, I should have said a bank. First point, bank-wide risk policy, risk appetites. That essentially means that the bank will have to determine, given the types of climate risks in the regions it is operating in, it'll have to determine its level of risk acceptance, risk avoidance. In clear and concrete terms for a bank, this means knowing what the risks are. Will I lend or will I not lend? And if I do, at what price? Now you straight away see the interactions and links that this can have, especially if you're considering certain regions that might be more prone to extreme events than others. And you can also see the impact this can have if all the lenders to a certain region make, for similar reasons, the same kind of decision, in particular, a decision of risk avoidance. Then you straight away have a link, and it becomes, or can become, issues about access to credit, so coverage, affordability, and issues related to, and such issues related to financial inclusion. On a systemic, or let's say system-wide level. Second item, or second step, of course, when we're talking about integrating risk management, you need to be able to identify your climate risks. That implies a review of all exposures, and that's far from being easy. It also implies, in some cases, it all depends how much resources you can put in, and it's a balance, of course, for the financial institutions between not only the resources they have, but how much is at risk. It's obvious that if you only have a small portfolio, you will probably not go spending, or small portfolio of, say, credit risk exposed to, a region, let's say, subject to floods, then you'll probably not go and spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions into drilling down to the most exposure level of granularity. However, if you have much bigger portfolios, it might be worthwhile, and in particular, some of the specific metrics that are being considered, and that at least experimentally some banks are starting to use, relate to geolocation, in particular for real estate claims, real estate loans, mortgage loans, but also perhaps for corporates. It's going to make a little difference for a corporate in terms of the kind of transition risk it might be subject to, depending on whether it has a plant 5 miles away, or whether it is in a certain region or in another one. Geolocation and sectors therefore matter. And here, a little aside, that's where this is all about risk differentiation. And one of the little problems that banks might have and are having with green versus brown taxonomies, in other words, green versus brown systems of classification, is that by definition, there are classifications, they're binary classifications, or even when they're more sophisticated, they're going to give you shades of green perhaps and shades of brown, but they're not necessarily going to be able to allow you to differentiate by counterparty. In other words, not the right tool. The other little problem with those taxonomies quite often is that somehow they are established, they are what some people would call point in time, or can be, let's say, point in time assessments. The meaning here is that there's one factor that they can't take into account, and that's changes in technology. They are done at a certain point in time with a certain level of technology as it exists now, in other words. Now, risk assessments and quantifications. Here we could go through all the different, various steps. There's just one thing or 2 points I'd like to insist upon, just to show you that it's far from obvious for a bank to do those risk classifications, or to do rather those risk assessments and quantifications. One is the issue about time horizons. As you all know, banks typically assess their exposures either on the 1-year basis, because that's when they do their budgets. That's the time horizon they have in terms of financial statements, or at most, if they do it, if they do an assessment for strategic purposes, it's going to be a max of 5 years. Problem with climate change is, as you've seen, is that in some cases, the projections go out 30, 50, 80 years. So the little challenge here is how you reconcile the two completely different sets of horizons. The other little problem, and that's a very practical one that applies in particular to large banks and large international banking groups, are organizational issues. Because if you're going to manage your climate risks in terms of integrated risk management, this essentially means that you need to put in place risk procedures, risk aggregations. You need to be able to do it across jurisdictions, and you need to have a risk reporting system of your group-wide exposures so that these can be centrally managed. And even before they're managed, they need to be centrally reported. And this is where firms, financial firms, and banks in particular, start getting particularly interested in efforts of international bodies which are seeking to promote more consistency and more comparability. One big issue, of course, as you heard just before, is the issue of disclosures, international comparability vis-à-vis investors. But there's also another issue before that, and it's in terms of risk comparability, risk aggregation within a specific group. Say I'm a bank, I have operations in Brazil, and I have operations in the US, and I have operations in Europe. Corporates, lending to corporates. Say they're even in the same sector, to simplify things. Obviously, they won't be exposed to the same kind of physical risks. If the risks are higher in one country than in another, regardless of what country it might be, or even in one region than another, as a bank, in terms of good management, I would want to be able to differentiate. In other words, I would want to know that.
Jean-Philippe,
I'd want to reflect it in my pricing. Yes.
Warning, we have to finish the whole session in 10 minutes.
Okay, last slide, please. Now, the last point here about regulatory and supervisory issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. There's been, I won't go through the slide in detail, there's been a number of evolutions, especially since, I'd say, 2018, 2019, since the NGFS was established. As you can see, even quite recently this year, there's a growing number of financial supervisors and central banks that are publishing supervisory expectations. Also, there's been as I've already mentioned, the work underway from the Basel committees, task force on climate risk, First stage was just a stock take exercise of existing regulatory and supervisory initiatives. This has been published in April. The current stage is work on 2 fundamental research initiatives, which is due to be completed by mid next year. The transition channels and the existing set of methods and methodologies for assessing and measuring these risks. You had one of them explained to you in the presentation just before this one. And then the next phases, because there will be some, probably more than one, and that's encapsulated under the sentence, consider the extent to which climate-related financial risks are incorporated in the Basel framework, meaning review of the Basel framework to see where and what the gaps may be, and identify supervisory practices to mitigate them as much as possible. And that's all. Sorry, I've been a bit long perhaps.
Jean-Philippe, that's hardly all. That is a big agenda. You've covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much. I think there are 2 key summaries here. One is stuff is happening. We have very real risks beginning to impact and going forward that we have to figure out how to address. 2 is, unfortunately, it's complex because we're dealing with complex systems. We cannot, even with that, however, evade the challenge of looking at these risks because these are substantial and material. So we are stuck with this problem. We are stuck with this problem, which is we have to look at it. We have to figure out what it is. And we are, to be honest, working it out as we go, I think is the best way to put it. We've got a couple of questions that have come up that I just want to put to you in the last few minutes. With Bremco first. One question was, is the task force of climate-related financial disclosures, to get the long term right, making the financial system address systemic risks? And I guess this is particularly the case in relation to forests in the Amazon. So is protection of natural capital part of that? Is looking at investments, is there a flow? I mean, how are we managing that whole issue? And how does forest regulation impact this or get used? You know, we have a situation where we have a massive challenge in Brazil of managing and maintaining forest carbons. How does the link work in your experience? And Jean-Philippe, you may want to comment on that too, feel free, but Bremco.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the question. I mean, on the first part, which is around the systemic risks, you know, is the TCFD encouraging assessment not only of, you know, borrower by borrower, I imagine, risks or counterparty by counterparty risk, but is it encouraging assessments more at the systemic level? The answer is yes. I think the TCFD is encouraging all relevant risks that are linked to climate change to be assessed and included in disclosures. But of course, I think the more interesting question is what is feasible at this point? And I think the first generation methodologies that have been produced, they tend to focus on, well, what's happening with borrowers? Obviously, in light of, or counterparties, in light of wider sectoral developments, you know, what is happening with them, and then obviously try to aggregate it. But there are efforts underway, and the methodologies are advancing, also to make sure that supply chain wide impacts between sectors within supply chains, impacts between supply chains more than, you know, to the cross economy level, are also being considered. As I said during my presentation, for instance, there was an effort within that one methodology to also not look only at one sector through the direct carbon costs but rather to look at the entire supply chain within which that sector is embedded, and trying to also ascertain the more indirect supply chain impact. So the answer is yes, but it's work in progress, because the more elements you add and the more systemic you want to make it, of course, the more complex it becomes. In terms of the question around sinks, natural sinks, and especially forests. So, I think, these will show up on a number of fronts. On the transition front, the transition risk front, of course, we know tropical deforestation is responsible for, I think, round about 15% of global emissions, 15 to 20%, or land use emissions are 20%. And so definitely, so stopping that, because we need to stop that to become low carbon, stopping that will lead to transition risks for the industries and the supply chains at hand. Soft commodities, soy, sugarcane, beef, all of that. I think that's covered by the framework. The problem there is that the modeling, the greenhouse gas modeling that we have at the moment, including also in the IPCC, tends to be more advanced, I would say, on the emissions from the energy system than on the emissions from the food and the land use system. But that's a little bit my intuition only. I'm sure the land use emissions are picking up. And then there is also on the physical risk front, of course, a role for forests to play, and other ecosystems to play, because they are they can be considered often, risk buffers. Think of coral reefs in the age of sea level rise, or mangroves in the age of sea level rise. Think of forests, during heat waves. The list goes on. And so here again, natural systems will play a role there, both as as a source of risk when they're being degraded, but also as a risk mitigant if we manage to maintain them or even restore them.
Jean-Philippe, I'm interested in picking this question up for you. If I can focus it a bit, which was, Brazil has a lot of different biomes. It's a very complex ecological or geographical mass in that sense. How do we apply, talk about the issues in applying scenario planning and, of course, bank stress testing, given that complexity, which I guess applies to any bank across with a global reach and so on. But how do we tackle this, and maybe referencing the natural capital aspects of what Remco was commenting on, which I know is an area of interest of yours?
Well, first of all, of course, it depends on what bank you're talking about, what kind of resources are available, and therefore how much risk differentiation it can afford. If you go to the most granular level, as I was mentioning geolocation before, it can make a difference if you're looking at individual borrowers, whether your house is on the bank of the river or whether it's located on a hill 5 kilometers from the river. It can even make a difference. Even the type of soil on which your house is built can make a difference. If it's clay, it won't be the same thing as if it's something else in terms of exposures to flood risk. Then the other thing is, ideally, you should be able to have, but there too, it's a trade-off. It always is in a bank, between the amount of exposures that are at risk and the amount of resources, and therefore the level of granularity, detail the level of complexity, the amount you're ready to invest in it. If you're talking about a large country, such as Brazil, then you're probably talking about quite a few different physical risks, and perhaps even quite a few transition risks, even if it's the same policy applied in the country. So ideally, somewhere, if you're talking about one of the largest Brazilian banks, they might want to consider mapping, even if it's more or less artificial, cutting up the whole map of the country into various zones and coming up with, I'd say, different simulations for different regions, depending on what the climate risk drivers might be, the main drivers might be for those regions. Obviously, if you're talking about exposures at Manaus in the Amazon, you're not going to consider the same kind of climate risks that if you're looking at exposures in Rio. Not the same exercise. Now, obviously, you can cover all that and come up with an average, and that essentially is what we tend to do when you do a system-wide scenario analysis or even a stress test at the level of the whole system. But if you're a bank, you need generally more granularity than that.
I think that takes us to the next question. What, as an extension of that, is to what extent should regulators be establishing the scenarios for things like bank stress tests and perhaps picking up some level of guidance around these issues? Jean-Philippe first, then you may need to couch your answers in the context of investigation, and then Remco.
Okay, the quick and short answer is if you come up with requirements, or if you start setting scenarios for all of your banks, the whole economy, or even a subset of your bank, what you are essentially doing is applying a one-size-fits-all to a number of banks. In other words, in terms of risks, at the risk of being a little bit provocative, it's a one-size-fits-nobody. Meaning here that it's not going to fit perfectly well to the exposures of any banks, but the purpose here is not that. It's rather to get the big picture, system-wide, and or to be able to compare banks between each other. Remember, they've got different risks, they're using different modeling systems, different risk management systems, but at the end of the day, as a supervisor and regulator on the one hand, or if you're looking at it from a disclosure perspective, as an analyst or as a market investor, as an investor on the other hand, you need to be able to do your own risk differentiation. And their risk differentiation means comparability. And well, you know, you can only compare apples with apples. So to some extent, it will mean some level of papering over the cracks or making a number of simplifications. Otherwise, you don't have comparability. And if you don't have comparability, then what's the point of having disclosures? Mm-hmm. What's the point of being able to assess whether Bank B is better managed and or more profitable than Bank A or Bank C? So there has to be a trade-off and a delicate balance to find. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's typically what happens.
Interesting point. By the way, listeners, you'll appreciate we've gone a bit over time. We'll be finishing up in a couple of minutes to allow our speakers to go. Remco, any thoughts on this topic?
It's hard to disagree with what Jean-Philippe just said. I would just confirm that and second that. I think these risk assessments always are done, for an internal audience within a bank or within any other company that's looking at this, but they're also done for an external audience. If you're doing them for an internal audience, you should be using the scenarios that you think are best for your own, and that becomes the choice of scenario becomes a matter of competitive advantage. If you, however, are doing this for an external audience, be it your investors, your clients, your regulators, etc., and the question I think was around, should the regulator be doing this for stress testing, the results of which then are submitted to the regulator, then intuitively I would always say, well, there needs to be comparability. Without comparability and without a certain degree of standardization, the whole exercise becomes futile, pointless. And then the question, though, is, you're right. I think it's not about one scenario. I don't think it's because as I said earlier, you want to be assessing risks not only for a 1.5 future, but also for a 4-degree future. So I would classify this as there needs to be a suite of scenarios that somehow are reference scenarios. And that's exactly my understanding also what the NGFS is doing at the moment or has recently done to come up with a number of reference scenarios. That makes our work with the industry a lot easier. So for instance, the online tool that I presented earlier that translates our transition risk methodology into a software environment that includes those NGFS reference scenarios. So if you're using the tool, well, of course you will want to make use of those scenarios, perhaps among others, but especially those, because those are the ones that the regulator is for now recommending, and in the future, but also perhaps going, making mandatory as opposed to only recommending. You're muted, Sean.
Thank you, Remco. We need to wrap up this session, everyone. I'm after a couple of takeaway comments from you. I do want to say to Jean-Philippe, I'm going to argue with you separately, perhaps in detail, about the taxonomy, only because in Europe, as I've been intimately involved in developing it, we are absolutely looking at dynamic and technology agnostic. So I think the direction is actually reasonably okay, but you're right about the risk. There's certainly a risk that we ossify definitions at a time when we can't afford to ossify definitions. And there's a risk that we decide that a certain sort of plant's the right way to go. Wrong approach. A threshold approach, like an emission threshold, allows innovation to develop. And that's what we've tried to do in the European taxonomy. But within the constraints of the industry categorization systems, there are some challenges, I will accept. So longer conversation afterwards. I think from the point of view of people listening to this call, though, it's worth noting that for better or for worse, the European taxonomy will come into force in Q1 next year and will become the foundation for disclosure arrangements on the sustainable side for all investors, banks, corporations, and expected to be member states as well. So you will definitely have a common language with every 3-year review clause in it. So this is going to be a very interesting experiment. Clearly, it will impact on Brazilian markets because there are Brazilian companies who raise money in the European market or have European shareholders. So to that extent, there's a little bit of a cascading affair. There's an issue, therefore, for the Banco Central do Brazil to think about in terms of its flow on impact in the Brazilian circumstance. Note that there are taxonomy projects now underway in multiple countries. Colombia will soon have its taxonomy. Chile will start the development work next month on its taxonomy. South Africa, Russia, Kazakhstan, and China. China has a well-developed taxonomy, and we have a technical working group now looking at harmonization between the Chinese and the European taxonomies. So it's very fashionable, let's just say. Whether it solves any problems, well, I think the truth is we are dealing with what's called a wicked problem here, as we have known for some time. This is complex, deeply complex. But I think, as Jean-Philippe and Remco have said, we have no choice. The nature of the risks are so substantial. We did have a question earlier about climate risk versus social issues, a feeling that climate had increased in preponderance through the course this year. I'm not sure about that, actually. I think that the pandemic has shown that there are substantial social risks that we need to address too. The comment I would put to you, and I'm interested in whether Remco and Jean-Philippe think I'm mad, is that actually this is a basket of the same risk, because the pandemic is rooted in environmental degradation and pathogens jumping between species. The IPCC has been predicting pandemics would be a regular feature of the 21st century thanks to climate change. Their view is this is simply the first one, and there are going to be more, and we're in a race to see whether we can stop the severity and frequency of them going forward. So in that sense, the learnings we now take in as a result of this crazy global experiment of every country having a different approach to the pandemic, we're learning what works and what doesn't work, are actually climate resilience learnings. We are learning how to make our societies more resilient in the face of the kind of shocks that are coming through. Pandemics. I came off a webinar earlier today with regulators in the Philippines talking about typhoon shocks, a different kind of shock. The country I come from, Australia, has been buffeted by fire shocks this year. These are all examples of physical volatility that we now have to build in resilience to. And that is way more than just physical resilience, coastal protection. It's ecosystem resilience, it's social resilience and economic resilience, and hey, health sector resilience. Haven't we learned a lot about what we have to have in our health system to be able to deal with pandemics? So in that sense, I'm going to say the comment about the increase in social consciousness, I'm going to call it increase this year, including amongst investors. Remember, the European Union just placed 28 billion euros of social bonds with 300 billion of orders. So example of investor interest. This is actually part of one theme. This is very much needs to be sheeted back to an understanding of the risks that we heard about earlier, the policy, the impact, and of course, the liability risks that Jean-Philippe and Remco have been talking about.
I mean,
go ahead.
I think there's even, at a more fundamental level, a big parallel between what we're seeing, on the pandemic and what we have been seeing on climate change, but only recently, which is, if we want to tackle these problems, we need to listen to the science and the facts. And, in a COVID context, that was all about, we need to flatten the curve. That's the science. That's what we know. This is, this is what the models tell us, we need to do to get a control of the situation and not, overstress medical systems. On COVID, we've learned pretty quickly and dramatically, the costs of not listening to the science. And the same thing, is happening with climate change. We've not been listening to the science for the last 30, 40 years. The science has been, increasingly clear, and we still just ignore it. And perhaps COVID now shows us that that's not the way to solve the problem. We need to listen to the science. On the nexus between environment and social, there is a nexus, and there's a big nexus between social unrest and climate change. Not only through pandemics, I'm thinking of the Syrian civil war too, that many people, trace back to unprecedented drought and people moving into Damascus, and that creating, a whole set of frustrations with the population that then erupted in the civil war that's still going on. So those examples exist. There are though also examples of social risk, of course, that have nothing to do with the environment and nothing to do with climate change and with other factors of social security systems not being in place, even in some rich countries that give a propensity to large parts of the population, of course, feeling frustrated, and that resulting in at some point social unrest and other such things.
But we do know there is a direct correlation between successful development and, frankly, wealth, and the ability to be able to bounce back. So there is no doubt that, come what may, if we want to have resilient economies, we are going to have to make the poor economies wealthier. And that's the link between the development agenda and the climate agenda. At least that's my thought. Jean-Philippe, last word to you.
There's one little thing I'd like to add, since we've made the link between I agree with everything that's been said, by the way. Since we've made the link between the pandemic and climate change, is that we are currently in a situation where the pandemic is going to cost a fortune to everyone, not even mentioning the loss of life, which shows to what extent not dealing with a problem preemptively can cost and how much it can cost. The related problem here is that even if countries, and I'm talking about the rich, so-called rich countries, I don't know for how long, but so-called rich countries for the time being, even if those countries have spent fortunes in trying, and in up to now successfully, to more or less prevent their economies from collapsing, because that was what was at stake. A depression, 1930s style. There is still a need, the need for the huge investments to be able to adapt to climate change hasn't either disappeared or been reduced in any way. So what makes me slightly worried is that the current effort to finance COVID, whether in rich countries or in less rich ones, is going to have to come through more debt. And if we are on top of that going to finance climate change, which is a must, then it means more debt again. The little issue here is, for how long will this be sustainable? Mystery, question mark.
At low interest rates.
I couldn't prevent myself from a little bit of doom and gloom at the end.
Of course, if we keep interest rates very, very low, could last a while, but therein is a whole separate question. I would like to bring this to a close, as Jean-Philippe has so successfully opened up a new discussion topic for us to pursue in a separate conversation. Thank you for that close, Jean-Philippe, about where the hell debt is going. Thank you, Remco, for having joined us today. Thank you for the audience for having gone a bit over time with us. Back to our hosts, David Valente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kidney. Thank you to our panelists, Mr. Fischer and Jean-Philippe Svoronos. And now we will see the retransmission of Mr. Luis Pereira da Silva from the BIS, Bank of International Settlements.
The invitation for me participating in this event by the Banco Central do Brasil. I'd like to congratulate the organizers for this very timely and very important agenda. I know that there's been a lot of efforts put on the sustainability agenda by the Central Bank of Brazil. And this is very good. It complements many things that have been mentioned in the previous panels. I would like to share a presentation with you. And let me do this right now. So can you see the presentation that is on the screen now, and can you hear me? Hello?
Perfect.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about climate change and the contributions by central banks to this agenda. And I would like to focus my presentation on the evolution from the way in which we were seeing things moved by a single policy or a single actor and a sort of a magical silver bullet to a more complex agenda where you need to coordinate between multiple agents and undertake simultaneously several actions. If you think of the way we were seeing the agenda of threats to the environment, pollution, externalities a while ago, before this growing awareness in societies about climate change, it was a very elegant and relatively simple fashion derived from our idea of a general equilibrium framework, where if you have a local negative externality, for example, pollution by a firm, and if households didn't have perfect information, no price to guide them, you could use one aspect of fiscal policy, which is essentially the taxation of this negative externality. And for example, the establishment of a Pigovian tax on carbon to modify the behavior of firms and households. Firms, because of the cost of polluting, would be reducing it. Households, because of the tax on their quote-unquote bad behavior, would be also changing their consumption pattern. And this would sort of produce a gradual control over the negative externality and a reallocation of resources that would change the behavior of households and firms, and therefore you will have a sort of this unique instrument change in the behavior of agents in the economy. And instead of a bad equilibrium with global externalities, you would have a good equilibrium with the corrections of pollution and externalities. Now, we know that this did not work as expected. Of course, it's necessary to tax the externality and to have to establish a carbon price. But what we observed is that it was not enough. It is necessary, but not probably sufficient, because you have a number of behaviors that limit this policy instrument. You have lobbying by some agents, you have skepticism, you have limited appetite to tax the externality. You have, remember, this sort of myopic behavior by some. The effects of this negative externality is so far away in the future, the tragedy of the horizon, that you don't need to pay attention right now. You have the sort of this tragedy of saying that, well, this is something that concerns others and I won't necessarily change myself, my behavior, so I will take a sort of free riding. And all this actually prevented an effective pricing of carbon, prevented this reallocation I was alluding to. And therefore, with this limited change in behavior, you have a observed increase in greenhouse gas emissions, up to the point that it started triggering catastrophic events and threatening price and financial stability. And it was not only in a single country or at a local level, it was global. And because of the accumulation of greenhouse gas up to a certain level, it began triggering what climate scientists now are denominating climate change. If you want evidence of that and that the clock is ticking, you know very well that the best science today relates climate change or global warming to the accumulated greenhouse gas emissions. They continue to grow precisely because the corrective mechanisms that we have to change the behaviors are not working. And it's growing at a very alarming rate. It's growing fast, and it's growing to the point that it, of course, affects the average temperature on Earth in critical areas that threaten, of course, financial and price stability, but it threatens even the life of human beings in certain areas of the planet. And we are increasingly seeing climate change as really a global risk, really as a very significant market failure. And we are realizing that it affects all aspects of our life in society. It affects the demand side of our economies. Think, for example, on the table that is displayed in this slide about the investment component of aggregate demand, where you have uncertainty about the future because of global warming, and therefore you refrain from investing. You refrain also from consuming. On the supply side, it's also clear that because of global warming, you have severe effects on, for example, agricultural productivity. You have a loss of working hours because of extreme heat, and you have also a depletion and destruction of your capital stock. So the effects are global, the effects are pervasive, the effects are not necessarily being corrected by the single instrument we had in mind. And all this is very complex. We know that global warming, climate change triggers physical and transition global risks. But if you look at this little picture of some of these global risks, you can immediately see, and each of them has a color which relates to their occurrence above a certain average level of global temperature. Look at some of these events for increases of the temperature between 3 degrees and 5 degrees, such as the interruption of the jet stream, such as, for example, the threat to the polar ice sheets. You can immediately see that these are very complex events. The tipping points can trigger irreversible consequences. And these events are complex because they are not captured by our traditional forecasting tools. They have a number of non-linearities, they have a number of cascading effects, and this is why their pricing is complicated. Now at the BIS, together with the Banque de France, we label these climate change related risks green swamps. And of course, we were inspired by the image that was put out by Taleb Nassim during the global financial crisis of black swans. So we took this analogy, but for ourselves, a green swan has some common aspects with black swans. They create cascading effects. They are very negative. They have massive catastrophic impacts on society. But for Taleb Nassim, a black swan is much more a sort of very rare event, a very unpredictable event, very difficult to occur, sort of a tail risk event. But for us, we know from science that events related to climate change, green swans, these are very likely to occur or almost certain to occur. And when they occur, when they begin to occur, such as when we are observing now these increasingly frequent catastrophic weather-related events, they are irreversible. They pose an existential threat to societies. And it's very difficult to hedge against these events because they are global and they are pervasive. So we approach the notion of green swans from precisely this different notion of the risk perspective, and also the idea that they are bound to occur. We just don't know exactly when and how. And because of that, we are advocating that many things need to change in the way we approach these events and these types of risks. But the good news is that actually some things are changing. First of all, we are recognizing and we are in a position to better measure these climate change related systemic risks, because we are understanding now that the models that we need to use need to change from a sort of observation of past statistical and historical data and move towards a much more scenario-based, forward-looking type of model, because of the nonlinearities and the multiple ramifications of these events. And only when you do that, you can really begin estimating the true cost of these physical and transition risks through some of the tools that we have, such as integrated assessment models. We need to build a much more complex story about the transmission of these risks. The second message is that the central bank's role is very relevant, because these physical and transition risks affect the financial stability of our systems, and therefore it directly impacts the mandate of central banks. And it also is important for regulators and supervisors. And this is why the community of central banks, regulators, and supervisors created the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, that has a number of tasks at hand, including, for example, the new management of risks in the financial sector, but also improving the disclosure of these risks in the financial sector. There is special task forces that are identifying these types of more risky assets. And also this has been reflected on changes in prudential reflections and thinking in the Basel Committee for Bank Supervision. There is a task force that has been created. And finally, the most important thing is that it has been changing progressively. I think the mindset, as I was alluding to at the beginning of this presentation, of trying to go away from this idea that you could have a silver bullet to solve a climate change problem, a kind of unique solution through carbon pricing. It is necessary to think about the taxation of this externality, but you really cannot just think that one single agent, even as powerful as central banks, can be again the only game in town. The fight against climate change needs to be part probably of, or most likely of, a broader solution, a broader policy framework, coordinating with other agents, for example, governments, the private sector. It has to be, of course, a global coordination, because it is a global externality that requires global solutions. And it's very important, this change in mindset, because not only you have to understand the physical and transition risks, but you also need to sort of think of financing the transition towards a lower carbon economy, where central banks are helping, for example, by setting interest rates at a very low level, but by mainly also thinking of the way in which it facilitated the provision of credit to finance the transition by the private sector. So in a nutshell, we are now, I think, perhaps in a situation where there is growing awareness, there is recognition across many actors in society, private sector, central banks, governments. It's not always a consensus, but people recognize now, and the information is available, that there are these global risks. They can trigger a very dramatic, catastrophic crisis. And we need to move from this recognition to the opportunities that presents ourselves, particularly with the current crisis, to think of the transition towards a lower carbon economy and towards a green recovery. And this transition, this change, is not, again, going to come from one single instrument or one single act or one single policy. My view is that it will come from a combination of many things. Of course, macroeconomic policies, but also regulation and supervision. It will come probably from the fact that the current COVID-19 crisis has really increased the perception of the reality of these risks, and to some extent the urgency of acting. And it has at the same time triggered a new set of business opportunities, of investments. It has begun to change perceptions about how you should behave in this transition. What are the reputational risks that you're running if your company of yourself are not doing the right thing? And of course, one of the major actors in this change of behavior has been central banks. They have been engaged in many debates in the Basel Committee, as I mentioned, in the NGFS. And as you can easily imagine, there are areas where there is consensus, but of course there are also areas where there is still debate and discussion. For example, in monetary policy, one of the big contributions of central bank has been to run an accommodative monetary policy stance that helps to finance the transition. But many are also thinking of greening their collateral policy. For example, in terms of making sure that the assets that are used as collateral meet certain climate-related reporting obligations. Where there is a little bit less consensus is what to do with the very large asset purchase programs by central banks. Should they be more selective in terms of the assets that they use or not? This is a debate that is ongoing. Now, on the area of financial stability and regulation, I think there's been many progress in improving the taxonomy of green bonds. What exactly is the greenness of such financial instruments? And I think this, we have seen and we will see more progress in these ideas of ESG rating, disclosure, eventually making them mandatory in certain jurisdictions. This has been also progressing with more systematic stress testing and other macroprudential policies that take into account the risks represented by climate change to certain classes of assets. And it has also been reflected in central bank reserve management, in the way central banks run their pension fund policies, and so on and so forth. And last but not the least, in the way central banks have been supporting sustainable policies and green finance. And all this agenda, not necessarily all the components, but you can see that, for example, it is very present in the way the Central Bank of Brazil has been working its sustainability agenda that this seminar is about. It's not only central banks, the private sector is also playing a very important role, and particularly because it is now creating or thinking of new financial instruments to precisely help the change in the behavior of consumers and of investors. Private sector has been at the forefront of issuing more green bonds. It's a market of about $1 trillion today. It's relatively small, but it's growing. And many private asset managers are asking precisely more the creation of more of these green products, and the strengthening, the improvement of the way they can sort of easily explain to investors why is it that a green financial instrument is green. And there are many also interesting developments in terms of the co-financing of research with the private and the public, between the private and the public sector, and also in terms of facilitating the adaptation to a lower carbon economy. We know, and this is an important aspect, that climate change has distributional consequences, because it is usually the poor countries and the poor households that have more difficulties in changing their behavior, because they have to sort of bear additional costs in terms of the type of technology that needs to be used to change and to make a significant contribution to fight climate change. So as a conclusion, I think, again, we were in a world where we were thinking perhaps in isolation in terms of having a very important aspect, which is the taxation of the externality, greenhouse gas emissions, which again is necessary but not sufficient, and relying on governments to do this, relying on, let's say, the tax authority to do that. I think we are now in a situation where we realize that if you really want to address green swans, it requires global coordination with everybody playing its role. It requires immediate action because it's very urgent, and it requires the activation of many tools at the same time. Even if the world is not perfect, the world is not necessarily the perfect equations of a general equilibrium model. So coordination has to be done at the global level between governments, central banks, the private sector, international financial institutions, regulators. I think the NGFS has been playing a very important role. Even if you think that all this is still uncertain in terms of how to do it, don't wait. You really have to sort of engage each of us into action because of the severity of climate related risks. And you need to activate, as I said, many tools at the same time. It's not just carbon taxation. is risk models, integrated models, stress testing, disclosure, information, and so on and so forth. The second aspect of the conclusion is that if you do all this, you will be acting on the demand side of the equation, because you will be changing consumer behavior. The consumers will have more information. They will have a price incentive, hopefully, with carbon pricing. They will sort of have their sort of capacity to be alert and informed. You will be also acting on the supply side, because, for example, think of the very important initiatives to provide investors with more diversified portfolios, and also with new possibilities to discover new technologies, to sort of make sure that these technologies work. For example, think of carbon capture. Of course, we know that carbon capture, the natural way of doing this is by precisely preserving forests or increasing forests. But you have also industrial ways in which you can invest in research that will be doing exactly that. And then, as I was saying, all of this needs to be done thinking of the very tricky aspect of the distributional consequences of climate change, because of the capacity for poorer people and countries that have not reached a more advanced stage of development to finance their transition. And because the issue is global, you need to think of the instruments with which the international community will be contributing to help these countries that are less developed and have less financial power to finance themselves their transition. Finally, last but not the least, while we talk about climate change and the way in which this will affect our life in the future, we know very well that all these policy actions that are needed will be happening in the very special circumstances of COVID-19. And we need to understand that COVID-19 is creating at the same time, the situation where we are of difficulties, but also some opportunities. And we need to reflect on how to use this crisis to increase the speed of transition towards a carbon neutral society and to reduce our carbon footprint. So questions that I think are necessary for us to reflect, how the new macro policy stances will provide us with a bit more of a policy room, maybe on the fiscal front, if in some countries you have a lower cost for issuing debt. Of course, all this has to be done with caution. We have also to think of the regulatory perimeter of what we will be doing in terms of things that will favor precisely research and innovation in terms of the fight against climate change, how the non-bank financial institutions will contribute to that, the fintechs, and so on and so forth. We have, of course, to do this preserving competition and contestability in these markets. For example, pay attention to the dominance of certain big firms into this. And finally, again, at the end, we need to think of all these structural reforms that would enhance the resilience of our societies and the transition towards a lower carbon economy with, again, I insist, the consequences of all this, of these policies on the distribution of income and wealth. Because if you want to have a socially fair and peaceful transition towards a lower carbon economy, you have to sort of consider the financial implications of needing or of the need to facilitate these transitions for groups in societies that are more disadvantaged, that have lower incomes, that might be unemployed, that might not be capable of bearing the cost of this transition. And you have also to think of this in terms of the global implications of this transition, which means that some countries will necessitate the financial help to precisely be capable of conducting this transition. So hopefully we departed from the idea that we had a theoretical model where one instrument will do the job. And I think we are ending now with a more realistic view that fighting climate change requires many actors acting simultaneously, acting urgently, and acting with many, many instruments in a coordinated way at the global and at the local level, so that we can sort of provide a better and more sustainable future for our kids and also, of course, for ourselves. So I stop here and thank you very much. I stop the transmission.
Thank you, Luis Pereira, for your considerations. And on behalf of the Brazilian Central Bank and the German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ, I'd like to thank the participation from all panelists and our public in the webinar Regulatory Initiatives based on the Sustainability Dimension of AgendaBC hashtag. Have a wonderful day, everyone.